Genghis Khan. The land stretched for hundreds and hundreds of miles, so vast it seemed to have no end. It was a land of variety. There were towering mountain ranges, thick forests, raging rivers, and calm lakes, barren deserts, and most of all, there was the huge expanse of grassy plains called the steppes. There was no ocean for thousands of miles in any direction. In the spring, the weather was mild and the plains were covered with rich green grass. But in summer, the plains were scorched dry by a relentless burning sun. In winter, raging blizzards swept across it, and any waterways were frozen solid. During some times of the year, the temperature in one day could swing from a low of 45 degrees to a high of 101. And all year round, no matter what season, the plains were swept by forceful winds that could knock a man off his feet. This was Mongolia. It was the terrain that in the 12th century would give birth to one of the most powerful conquerors and greatest military geniuses of history, the greatly admired and equally greatly feared Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a man who personified the land in which he'd been born and would someday rule. He was rugged and fierce, but he could be generous and rewarding. He could glow like warm sunshine on those who were loyal, and he could blow like a devastating gale through the towns that had betrayed him. In his path, he could leave bounty or destruction depending on his whim. And like Mongolia itself, he seemed invincible. At the time Genghis Khan was born, no country needed a leader more than the country of Mongolia, situated at the top of China and to the south of Russia. There were three groups living in Mongolia: those who hunted and fished in the Siberian forests, those who tilled the soil and raised cattle, and those who wandered the plains with small herds of sheep, cattle, and horses. The wanderers were called Mongols. To survive in the vast and often hostile terrain of the plains, they developed uncommon skills of resilience and resourcefulness. They were superb horsemen, and their sturdy ponies were famous for their fortitude. They could carry their riders through freezing snowstorms or blinding sandstorms. They could withstand the arid Gobi Desert. They could climb rocky mountains, and they could travel for days across the steppes without tiring. The Mongols themselves had developed phenomenal memories that allowed them to navigate hundreds of miles without compasses, using instead what they remembered of the positions of trees, stones, stars, and the flights of wild birds. They were expert hunters and traders, and they were also expert thieves. To survive, they'd learned early on to steal whatever they could. If they were strong enough, they waged war to get what they needed. The Mongols were a short race, seldom taller than 5 feet 6 inches. But they had big, strong bones and massive chests. Their legs were bowed from lifetimes on horseback. Their faces were flat with high cheekbones, and they wore their wiry black hair in long braids that hung down their back. They were known for their piercing dark eyes and their flashing white teeth. The eyes of Genghis Khan were said by all who knew him to possess fire. During all their wanderings, the Mongols were constantly at war with each other and with the other peoples who inhabited Mongolia, forming alliances and breaking them, fighting over land and livestock, raiding caravans and camps, and kidnapping each other's women. Women were an especially valuable commodity. Men were not allowed to marry within their clan, and finding suitable wives was difficult. Clans also took slaves from other clans and tried to recruit warriors from each other. For hundreds of years in Mongolia, there had been no unity, no central leadership, and a steady disintegration of trust. Clans, families, and tribes had been completely splintered. It was a golden opportunity for a man with just the right capabilities, and such a man was born in the year 1162 in a small tribe in northeastern Mongolia. His birth was said to be auspicious because he emerged from his mother's womb clutching a large blood clot in his tiny fist that resembled a dark jewel. A wise man in his clan announced his interpretation of the event. The boy would grow up to be a heroic warrior. There were also rumors that one of his ancestors had been a gray wolf. The boy's father, who was leader of his tribe, named him Temujin, after one of his mightiest enemies, whom he defeated in battle. It was not until many years later that his people would dub him Genghis Khan. Temujin was only 13 years old when people began to remark on his fiery eyes and what they called the bright power in his face. He was an unusually energetic and alert child who seemed to command respect just by his presence alone. At this time, Temujin's father took him on a long journey to find a bride. They found one in the daughter of the chieftain of a wealthy tribe to the southeast, towards China. Her name was Bortai. As was customary, Temujin was to stay with the tribe a while and get to know his in-laws while his father returned home. It would turn out to be a very short stay, for his life was soon to take a dramatic turn in a new direction. When Temujin's father was traveling home, he came across a tribe that held an old grudge against his clan. They slipped a slow-acting poison into his food, and by the time he reached home, 3 days later, he was nearly blind and doubled over in excruciating pain. His last words were an order to his servants to go and retrieve Temujin so he could take over command of their small family. Shortly after Temujin returned home, quarrels broke out in the clan and members split off in different sects. Eventually, the entire clan went off to its summer pastures, abandoning Temujin and his family to die. He was still just a child, and he had a mother, 4 brothers, 2 half-brothers, a sister, and an old woman servant to take care of. Now began the years of struggle. The family scrambled for their food, living on wild berries, garlic, onions, and other roots. The boys hunted for rodents and became skilled at catching fish. It was a hard adjustment for a family used to living on rich mutton and mare's milk. Temujin was only 15 when he enlisted the help of one brother in killing his stepbrother for stealing a trout from him. Over the next 4 years, Temujin became increasingly strong and skilled at survival. Word spread through the steppes that the family had survived, and that Temujin had grown into a fierce warrior who might seek revenge for the way his family had been deserted. This frightened the tribe that had abandoned them, so they descended on the family and took Temujin captive. They put a heavy wooden yoke around his neck and shoulders, and then fastened his hands to the yoke so he was in constant pain. But Temujin's years in the wilderness had turned him into a fighter. One evening, he swung the heavy yoke against his guard, knocking him out. Then he ran into the woods and hid. He was found there by a member of the clan who had been impressed by his fiery spirit and his courage, and who helped him escape. Temujin never forgot this man. When he became Khan, he rewarded the man with land, servants, and special privileges. Once he was free, Temujin became determined to form his own clan so he would no longer be vulnerable to attack from enemies. He went back to reclaim his child bride, forming an alliance with her clan. Then he used his marriage gifts to buy favors with other clans. Wherever he went, he attracted friends and followers who were drawn by his strong personality and persuasive speech. With these followers, he began raids on enemy camps, acquiring horses and other animals, and sometimes land. By the time he was only 17, he had become a minor lord, and was known for miles for both his fierceness towards enemies and his fairness with friends. When he was 21, an assembly of chieftains proclaimed him Genghis Khan, which means either universal ruler or invincible prince. They swore to him their loyalty in war and the hunt. He in turn proclaimed to them, "Be of one mind and one faith, that you may conquer your enemies and lead long, happy lives." That conquering began in earnest. Temujin launched attack after attack on clans and tribes that had offended him, gathering more strength and more men with each victory. As his power rose, other clans came to seek alliances with him, offering more men and horses in his service. In only a few years he had an army, and it was the most skilled and clever army to march the earth since the days of Alexander the Great. The army of Genghis Khan was so well disciplined and trained that it could defeat armies twice its size and could overtake walled cities that had been considered impregnable for centuries. Khan organized his army in an entirely new way. He formed a mounted cavalry based on the number 10. There were squads of 10, with 10 squads in a squadron, and 10 squadrons in a quran of 1,000 men. 10 qurans formed a tuman of 10,000 riders. There were daily drills and practices to teach his men to move as a unit. They could follow his commands swiftly, accurately, and with remarkable dexterity. Not until recent times was there an army as mobile as that of Genghis Khan. He said, "Those who were adept and brave fellows I have made military commanders. Those who were quick and nimble I have made herders of horses. Those who were not adept I have given a small whip and sent to be shepherds." He chose his friend Bogarchai as commander of his armies, because as a youth Bogarchai had helped him reclaim 8 horses that had been stolen from him. Khan always remembered loyalty and always rewarded it. He also developed a new defense strategy. Instead of fighting from within a circle of wagons, which was the standard defense of the time, he ordered his cavalry to line up in the front row. Behind them he put heavily armed men, and behind them was the forest. There were blocks 100 men wide and 10 men deep. When the attackers moved in, the cavalry released a blizzard of arrows and then dashed to the rear. Then the heavily armed men would charge the enemy while they were barely recuperated from the arrows. Genghis Khan used this method over and over, and it became the means by which he conquered much of his world. He was keenly aware of the importance of taking the initiative in battle, and always ordered an attack, even when his troops were supposed to be on the defense. The Khan was also a master of surprise. He tried not to repeat the same strategies in any one campaign. Other times he would pretend to be in retreat, then turn and surprise the enemy. He also liked to feign an attack from the front when in reality his strongest forces were sneaking up from the rear. An Armenian at the time said of the Mongols, "They appear where least expected." By the time Khan was 44, he had become the first man to rule over all the Mongol tribes, a major event in world history. His kingdom stretched for 1,000 miles and included 2 million people, most of whom were filled with pride at being subjects of such a mighty and fearless ruler. As a ruler, Khan was exceptional for his times. Although he himself was illiterate, he hired scribes to teach his close ones and the children in his camp to read and write. He also hired a scribe to stay by his side and record all his words, and, most importantly, to record the new code of laws he'd developed. He called these laws the yasak, and said, "They shall guide men who come after me, even for 1,000 years. If they depart from my yasak, the realm will crumble. They will then call for Genghis Khan, but will not find him." His laws prohibited lying, spying, quarreling, using magic, or taking advantage of superstitions, and varying guidelines for the behavior of his soldiers and for women when men were absent at war. Women were given far more respect and responsibility than was customary. Khan established a code of honor that was so effective that under his reign theft, murder, robbery, and adultery virtually disappeared. People who were accused of crimes almost always admitted it if they were guilty, and many who broke the law even turned themselves in and asked to be punished. Genghis Khan himself lived fairly modestly and had a hatred of pretension and ritual. He directed his princes to call him by his birth name, Temujin, and never used a title even when he signed important papers. He always held on to his sense of his own roots, as a nomad, and continually valued courage over wealth and power. He lived in a tent his whole life, although it was a larger and more elaborate tent than anyone else in camp, and once said, "Perhaps my children will live in stone houses and walled towns, not I." The most important rule when a camp was set up was that nothing must be put in front of his tent to obscure his view. As the size of his army increased, Khan rearranged it so that often his divisions, previously 10,000 strong, were 30,000 strong. These hordes of men were so skilled and determined that just the sight of them struck terror in the enemy. They would burst out of the steppe and into battle with loud, warlike yells that could be heard for a long distance. Said a man who had seen them pass by, "They have voices more shrill than an eagle." Another said, Khan's army is as numerous as ants and locusts. His warriors are as brave as lions." Every member of the cavalry had a backup of 2 or 3 extra horses, enabling the army to advance for days at a time at unprecedented speed. Khan himself always kept a bodyguard of 1,000 men and a standing army of 10,000 nearby. The soldiers themselves ranged in age from 15 to 70 years old. There was a system of promotion to guarantee that anyone who performed with courage and loyalty was rewarded. It was customary before Genghis Khan to promote soldiers on the basis of their family connections and background. He appointed his officers instead on the basis of achievement, thus assuring not just skill, but loyalty. 2/3 of the Khan's soldiers carried the enormous Mongol bow and a large supply of arrows, a lasso, a collection of light spears, and a sword. They were protected by leather shields, helmets, and long leather tunics. The cavalry, which was out in front, wore full leather armor and carried a lance, a scimitar, that's a saber with a long curved blade, and bows and arrows. Genghis insisted all his men wear coarse silk shirts under their armor, since he discovered that arrows could seldom penetrate the rough natural fiber. It was a crime under the laws of the Khan not to retrieve arrows dropped by fallen soldiers, and all wounded soldiers were given aid as soon as possible. No injured soldiers were abandoned on the field. Another important innovation of Genghis Khan was his messenger service. Because the Mongol army was huge and often spread across a vast terrain, Khan established a system of messengers on horseback. Everyone, from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest noble, had to move aside to let the messengers through. The messengers were swathed in cloth bandages head to toe to protect them from the battering they took as they sped along for days at a time, sometimes even sleeping in their saddles. When their horses tired, they were replaced by fresh ones that had to be given freely by anyone along the way. The amazing messengers of Genghis Khan could cover in a few days a distance that took normal riders weeks to travel. As a result, Khan always knew what was going on, even in the farthest corners of his realm, and his commanders were able to coordinate their efforts in a powerfully effective manner. He was also the first ruler of his time to demand that his messengers always tell him the truth. The custom before then was that messengers reported only the good news. Those who inadvertently reported bad news were punished and even killed. Khan reversed this pattern, insisting on knowing both the good and bad news. As a result, he had a tremendous advantage over his opponents, who often had an inaccurate picture of what was happening on the field. He also used a simple but effective system of black and white signal flags, by which commanders could direct the movements of their troops. When it was dark, the flags were replaced with a system of flaming arrows. Khan was also one of the first to use psychological warfare. Before every campaign, he sent spies out to spread rumors about the terrible destruction and slaughter caused by the Mongols, to weaken the enemy's resistance. He had them spread the word that the Mongols were lenient with those who surrendered, but vicious with those who resisted. Propaganda that happened to be true. As a result, it was not unusual for an entire town to give up without a fight. But in spite of his occasional leniency, Khan once said, "A man's greatest work is to break his enemies, to drive them before him, to take from them all things that have been theirs, to hear the weeping of those who cherish them." In 1209, when Khan was 47 years old, he led 80,000 soldiers across the Gobi Desert in the south of Mongolia and met 50,000 Chinese at the border. He defeated them and proceeded further into China, conquering city after city. As Khan's empire stretched further into China, he soon came upon a new military challenge. The walled cities and fortresses, built hundreds and sometimes thousands of years earlier to protect the Chinese against invasions from the north. He immediately began courses for his soldiers in how to lay siege on such cities. They learned to make towering ladders that enabled them to scale walls, and they designed special shields that protected them from arrows directed from heights. They developed a method of using burning oil to scald their opponents, and had several different methods for starting fires in the cities under siege. The Khan used huge traveling trains made of pack animals and wagons that carried catapults, battering rams, and various contraptions for firing missiles over city walls. He developed a highly skilled corps of engineers, sometimes recruiting experts from the cities he'd conquered. Finally, the Mongols came to Beijing, the current capital of China. Although Beijing was smaller than it is today, it was still one of the largest cities in the world, and it was surrounded by a 26-mile-long wall with 12 closely guarded gates. Khan's army managed to set the entire city on fire, then looted it of its valuable jewels, silk, gold, silver, and artisans. All along the way, in whatever country he was in, Khan valued and captured scholars, craftsmen, and officials. The artistic and cultural achievements of each conquered area were quickly integrated into the Mongol society, which soon became the most advanced on earth. When the Khan returned to Mongolia, he was greeted by joyous subjects, celebrating his triumph in China. He brought with him enough slaves for every Mongol in his empire and enough plunder to make every family wealthy. However, while he'd been away fighting in China, his enemies in Mongolia had seen a chance to try and seize power. He shifted his focus to those who threatened his power at home, eradicating enemies and often killing their children so they wouldn't grow up and seek revenge. He was now 54 years old, but he still possessed enormous energy he would need for another challenge that was rising. To the west of the Mongol Empire was an area of the ancient Persian Empire that consisted of the countries we now know as Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region of the Soviet Union known as Turkestan. The leader of this vast region was a Muslim named Shah Muhammad. The Khan hoped to trade with the Shah because his area could supply many things the Mongols needed, including metal helmets, shields, carpets, and glass utensils. The two signed a treaty that provided for the continuance of the ancient trade route from the Mediterranean Sea to China. Khan was happy with the treaty, but both the treaty and his happiness were short-lived. Khan sent a caravan west, loaded down with valuable goods and special representatives of his empire, to negotiate trade with the Muslims. A governor in one of the Muslim provinces ordered an attack on the caravan. All its treasures were stolen, and nearly 200 people, including the Khan's personal representative, were killed. Khan was furious, but he did not at first seek revenge. Instead, he sent a group of ambassadors to protest to the Shah and demand that the governor who had ordered the attack be punished. The Shah, furious that barbarians would dare to judge one of his governors, had the lead ambassador killed. Then he shaved the beards of all the other ambassadors and sent them back home in shame. In so doing, the Shah virtually declared war on the Mongols, an extremely unwise decision. His own empire was in a state of decay. It was torn by dissension and rebellions, had suffered terrible famines, and lacked both unity of spirit and a unified government. Every advantage the Mongols had, he lacked. Genghis Khan wept when he heard of the murder of his ambassador, a man he'd specially chosen for his loyalty and diplomacy. Then he screamed, "Let the eternal blue heaven help me to find energy for revenge." The eternal blue heaven was the deity of the Mongols, and Khan often prayed to it. From the very beginning, he felt his mission was divine and preordained. If not for the Shah's rash behavior, the Mongol Empire would have probably never extended farther than China. But as it was, the Shah opened the way for a Mongol invasion of the western half of the Asian continent. His slaughter of the Mongolian ambassador, which occurred in 1206, was one of the most pivotal events in history. Khan knew he was setting out for the first time into unfamiliar territory to fight an unfamiliar enemy, against armies that far outnumbered his own. He also knew he was not young anymore. Before he left Mongolia, he named his youngest son, Ogatai, his successor, because Ogatai was known for his generosity, his ability to get along with everyone, and his common sense. The Khan's other sons, Ogatai's brothers, readily agreed with his decision. The Khan sent messengers throughout his empire and gathered an army of 250,000 men. Then he organized a siege train of catapults, battering rams, and flamethrowers. To confuse the Muslims, he had his army approach from 4 different directions. Their first destination, the town of the governor who had murdered his entire caravan of traders and representatives. The town fought hard. It knew no one captured would be spared, and the battle raged for 6 months. When the Mongols finally took the city, Khan ordered that the eyes and ears of the governor be filled with hot molten silver, and that he then be slowly tortured to death. The Mongol forces then moved from city to city on a mission of pure rage and revenge. It was this sweep through Eurasia that gave Genghis Khan and the Mongols the reputation for savagery they still have today. The Khan put his captives in the front lines, dressed as Mongols, so that Muslims ended up killing their own comrades first. His troops moved steadily westward, laying waste everything in their path and showing little mercy. The Khan announced, "All who surrender will be spared. Whoever does not surrender, but opposes with struggle and dissension, shall be annihilated." In one town they split the stomachs of all their victims in search of jewels they believed the people had swallowed. In another town they rounded up 70,000 men, women, and children, and shot them all with arrows. In still another town, where the Khan's son-in-law had been slain months before, they spent 4 days slaughtering everything that was alive: adults, children, babies, even dogs and cats, while the Khan's grieving daughter sat and watched, satisfied her husband had been avenged. Then, to make sure no one had survived, every victim was decapitated. They spared only 400 artisans, whose work would be valuable to the empire. All along their way, they destroyed oases, orchards, gardens, vineyards, cornfields, dams, palaces, and the work of centuries. Because of this savagery, a 13th century historian called them a detestable nation of Satan that poured out like devils from Tartarus, so that they are rightly called Tartars. Tartarus is a classical word for hell, and forever after Europeans referred to the Mongols as Tartars. Yet when the destruction was over, and the Muslims had been taught their lesson, the Khan recruited Muslim scholars and officials to teach him about the culture and cities of the lands he'd conquered, so that he could rule them efficiently and productively. By the time he had won this entire empire, Genghis Khan was in his late 50s and beginning to think of his own death. He sent for a famous Taoist monk from North China, hoping the holy man could tell him the secret of immortality. The monk had no secret for eternal life on earth, but he did speak of Taoist principles, of the force without name that guides the world, of the importance of simplicity, purity, and moderation. Although the Khan was disappointed not to find a means for immortality, he was interested in Taoism, and had his scribe record all that the monk said. One day on a boar hunt, the Khan fell from his horse, something that had never happened to him before. His family encouraged him to give up hunting and other strenuous activities, but he refused. When he was 64, he headed out for battle again, taking 180,000 men to suppress a rebellion among his subjects in China. On the way, he participated in another hunt, was thrown from his horse, and suffered severe internal injuries. That night he developed a fever, but resisted the suggestion of his generals that he return home to recover. He said it would make the Mongols look weak. The accident happened in December, but the Khan held on until spring as his armies neared victory. Then he became too ill to continue. He told his generals, "Despite all expectation, the time of my last campaign and of my passing is near. I wish to die at home. Let not my end disarm you, and on no account weep for me, lest the enemy be warned of my death." Every effort must be made, he said, to keep his death a secret until the battle was completely won. The Khan returned home and summoned his children and grandchildren to him. He gave each an arrow and asked them to break it. Then he said, "This is what will happen to you if you try to go through life alone." Then he gave each a sheaf of arrows, which they could not break. He said, if you stay together and help one another, do not trust enemies and follow my laws, you will be safe." Genghis Khan died quietly in his mountain camp in August 1227 at the age of 65. His body was put in a cart, and 1,000 noblemen and their warriors escorted the cart on a long journey to the mountain where Khan had chosen to be buried. The entire journey, across mountains, through forests, and across deserts and streams, was made in complete silence. As was the custom in the death of a Mongol ruler, the soldiers killed every living thing that they encountered along their way, animal or human. They buried Genghis Khan beneath a single tree on a mountaintop in a location meant to be kept secret. 1,000 men guarded the burial site. As the years passed, the area became covered by forest, so that today there is no sign of the final resting place of the great Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan died, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Black Sea in the west to the Sea of Japan in the east. It stretched from the Black Sea south to the Arabian Sea, and then northeast across China. Before he died, he said to his children and grandchildren, "With heaven's aid, I have conquered for you a huge empire, but my life was too short to achieve the conquest of the world. That task is left for you." They took him at his word. Khan's descendants, including his grandson Kublai Khan, carried on his work, marching through southern China into Korea, into Western Asia, northern Russia, and the areas that are now Poland, Germany, and Hungary. By 1294, only 67 years after Khan's death, the Mongol Empire ruled over 1/2 of all the human beings on Earth. When Marco Polo returned from China the following year, he brought to Europe the first accounts of the splendor of the empire and the achievements of its ruler, Kublai Khan, a man of a far less fierce temperament than his grandfather. What Genghis Khan accomplished in his life is almost impossible to imagine. Unlike Alexander the Great, he started from obscure beginnings and a childhood marked by poverty and struggle. Yet he ended up ruling the largest land empire in history. He was the very first to unite the Mongol tribes and other nomadic tribes into an effective fighting force and a cohesive society. He managed this with a political and military genius that can be matched by only a handful of men in history. He had great physical strength and energy, determination of purpose, and a will that was unbreakable. Yet he would seek and listen to advice from others, even his wife and mother, in a century that normally gave women little respect. His passion for loyalty was as deep as his passion for revenge. The Khan's greatest asset was probably his flexibility and his ability to adapt. He learned from every experience and modified and improved his techniques to suit new situations. Today, Genghis Khan is remembered mostly for his brutality. Yet he was neither the first nor the last nomadic conqueror to ride out of the steppe and sweep terror across Eurasia. His campaigns, however, were larger, more successful, and more lasting than any other. He was brutal in war, but believed he was being just. In his own mind, he was punishing those who had offended, particularly in his war against the Muslims who had violated their treaties of peace and trade. As savage as he could be, he was known for his fairness and generosity with his own people. He also contributed much to the development of his lands. He opened great roads throughout his empire, and free trade flourished from east to west. Under the Mongols, the compass, the firearm, and printing techniques reached Europe, and the arts and sciences of China flourished. Today, the name Genghis Khan is almost always associated with destruction and brutality. Yet destruction and brutality were not his invention. They were a way of life in 13th century Asia. He had learned them from his own contemporaries, and they were as acceptable by the standards of his time as peace and humanism are by ours. His opponents were equally as barbaric. In one town, the Khan's men were put into large vats of water and boiled alive. Genghis Khan was simply destructive in a far broader range and in far greater numbers than anyone else had been. He was, in the long run, the ultimate personification of his time and culture, both in its worthiness and its wretchedness.
This is the end of the session.